Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hello everybody.
Hello everybody.
Thank you very much for joining this lecture with Professor Alex. Professor Alex, thank you very much for your willingness to spend your time sharing your expertise, your experience with us, with our students. This is the first time overseas professor giving a lecture in our department. We are very lucky, Thank you very much. We really appreciate it. Before the lecture started, I will briefly read Professor Alex bio. Professor Alex is the first Dean of Research at Trinity University. Previously, he was the Director of Center for Social, Cultural and Legal Research at Derby University, UK. He also a member of some professional bodies like International Studies Association, the Political Studies Association, the former convener of the International Political Economy Group of the British International Studies Association, editor series. He also wrote not some, journal articles, book chapters, and also valuable reports. Yeah, that's an amazing bio, I think. Okay, Professor Alex, I'm sure we are not patient to wait your lecture. I will give you about 40 minutes. Is that okay for you?
Yeah.
Okay, 40 minutes. Yeah, and then we continue with discussion session for about 30 minutes. Okay, Alex, the time is yours, please.
Okay, that's great. So, I'm going to look in two different ways. Don't be put off by that. I've just got two different screens with you on one and my slides on another, and I'll show those in a moment. It's probably worth me saying a few things about my background, and first of all to say thank you very much for inviting me here to speak to you today. It's really a privilege for me to speak to people in all sorts of other countries, and it's a feature of our modern life, isn't it, that we're doing more and more of this kind of streaming and international meetings while I'm actually sat in my son's bedroom because I could get the best internet today. So that's a feature. And actually immediately after this, I'm going to a meeting in Nairobi, but it's not obviously not in Nairobi. It will still be in my son's bedroom. So a few words about my kind of background. So as Shinta said, I've got a number of kind of strands to my work. So one is kind of an academic strand of thinking and researching about the nature of inequality, and that's been my kind of the main area of my research for the last 6 or 7 and 8 years or so. But at the same time, I do a lot of research for international organizations and different governments. And that's not unconnected to inequality, but it's much more focused as policy research. So I do a lot of research, for example, at the moment with the Inter-American Development Bank on ways in which labour market policy might respond to inequality. And there we're thinking about inequality in multiple different forms, and I'm going to draw on that in the lecture. So we're thinking about socioeconomic inequality, but also gender inequality, inequality between different racial groups. In Latin America, there are indigenous groups that are excluded from the labour market or excluded from the formal economy and often kind of work in agriculture and the informal economy. So there are all sorts of different aspects of inequality, and my research touches on those in two different ways. One as a kind of a academic study of the broad overall picture of inequality, and then another set of work that is much more detailed and policy focused. So I'm going to draw mainly on the former today, so the kind of broader study of inequality as an international problem for international studies, broadly speaking, but including development studies, which I think is your main area of interest. But although I kind of want to finish by making an argument that development studies needs to be more than development studies in order to come to terms with the systemic nature of inequality as a social problem. So with those comments in place, and then just a quick management of expectations, I suppose. I don't know what you've been doing up to now. So I had a little bit of an insight from Shinta, obviously. So apologies if I start to basic and you've already done some of this stuff and you're very familiar with that. I don't mean to be kind of patronizing in that sense, and apologies if I end too broad, but then it would be really interesting to get your kind of sense of, or for me to get a sense of what you're interested in, and to shape that in the discussion that follows. So please do ask me questions, and don't feel at all inhibited about doing that. So things that I'm going to do, I'm just going to give you a broad overview. I'm not going to talk about learning outcomes. This is my general kind of beginning for lectures with students. I'm not going to do that today. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about how we might define and measure inequality as an international studies or as a development problem. And some of the things that are often left out of that or intersect with those kinds of definitions. And then give a very, very brief potted history of inequality as an international issue. And then I want to spend a little bit of time unpacking what I see as the problem or the problematic or the puzzle related to inequality as an international problem now. And as I say, finish by sort of saying that, if we are going to address this as a problem, then we need interdisciplinary study at multiple different scales and levels. And I try and see my research. If you look at my kind of program of, just as Shinta started out with publications and so on, you see I'm doing all sorts of different things. And I like to think of this kind of framework of time, scale, space as a way of drawing those things together. So I'll say a few things about that at the end. So let's move on to kind of define and measure inequality. So a first kind of cut, everybody knows what we mean by inequality, and they can think of this as just straightforwardly differences of wealth or income between different groups of people. But as soon as we start to unpack that as a definition, we get into all sorts of problems or all sorts of complexities, at least. So we're thinking, first of all, inequality of what, whether that is wealth, whether that's income, whether that's health. And there's research, certainly in Europe, over recent years has gone into a great deal of depth in trying to unpack what we might mean by health and, life expectancy, quality adjusted life years, well-being adjusted life years, all manner of technicalities to try and measure what we mean by inequalities in health. We can also think about inequalities in death, obviously, in terms of life expectancy. And that's been very to the fore, obviously, in the last 2 or 3 years, thinking about COVID and how that has affected different countries and different segments of the population in different ways. So, vulnerability to disease is certainly not an equally shared experience. We can think about inequalities of consumption, and that's quite a nice way of thinking about inequalities often. It doesn't work when people get very rich, but when people are quite poor, it works as a very good measure of inequalities, because what they're able to consume is a very good measure of their living standards. Might mean experience of violence. A lot of my colleagues, I've worked in a criminology department for the last, or alongside criminologists for the last 5 or 6 years, and a lot of my colleagues spend an awful lot of time measuring inequalities in the experience of violence, either by the state or by other non-state actors, criminals. Inequalities of education, inequalities of power. So when we think about inequalities of what, there's almost an unending list that we can apply to that idea. And then obviously inequality between people, households, that tends to be the most preferred measure. And then of course there's a lot of technical work to do in terms of trying to measure households of different sizes and compositions on an equal basis, you know, with and without children, with multiple adults and so on. There's a whole history of research on class, which is you know, a sociological tool to try and segment the population into different socioeconomic groups, and I think it's fair to say that even today we don't have any accepted measure of class, and a great deal of the battles in sociology over the last 20 or 30 years have been about trying to reconcile different understandings of class, genders, sexes, sexualities. You know, certainly in among undergraduate students in the UK, this is a massive issue right now, with, you know, a great deal of fluidity about what's meant by these terms, and contestation about what's meant by these terms. We have what people sometimes summarize as a culture war going on, particularly around definitions of gender and sex. And you know, some people arguing that gender is or that sex is a category that we should no longer think about. So we should no longer think about people being biologically male or female, but instead think about their gender as a self-identifying construct. And that's a huge issue. And you know, if you slip up in the classroom and say something you don't quite mean, just because it's familiar language in the UK right now, that can get you into all sorts of trouble with undergraduate students who would object to a particular rendering of the idea of sex or gender. I nearly did slip up there. And then obviously ethnic groups, and again across Europe and North America in particular, over the last 4 or 5 years, this has become a very hotly contested issue, particularly thinking about the international Black Lives Matter movement and the way in which that's pressed, alongside a number of other pressures for what we might call decolonization of academic study of a range of issues, including inequality. And then a more familiar way of thinking about inequality is between states. So all that's by way of saying the very obvious, of course, but it's a way of also problematizing that whenever we think about inequality, we often have to clarify our terms so that we're all talking about the same thing, and be careful that our interest in one aspect of those inequalities doesn't lead to the exclusion of others, which is certainly one of the claims of, for example, of the decolonizing movement, is that's been left out of the academic study of international affairs, of sociology, social policy, development studies, and so on. Okay, so just to deepen this a little bit and clarify my own terms of what I'm going to try and speak about today, I think we're probably going to talk in the main about two forms of, or two broad types of inequalities that are at the same time distinct and also overlap and interrelate with one another to cause particular manifestations of social problems in the international system, and particular development studies problems too. So first of all, thinking about domestic inequalities, or in the main, although this is problematic for the reasons I've already said about income and wealth, and they are in the main studied because they are easier to measure than some other forms of inequality, and try and think about those between different social groups and how they relate to each other. So very clearly, differences in income inequality also relate to differences in inequality in life expectancy, for example. And that's true in most countries of the world. Inequalities between, and then the second way in which I'm going to try and discuss inequalities, an international problem, is inequalities between the political units in our international system, which are, you know, the primary political units of our international system are states. You might argue that there are others, you know, regional blocks and so on, as well as sub-state units. But in the main, I'm going to try and juxtapose domestic inequalities between households, but also between gender groups, and then between political units or states. And I think, thinking about bringing that together is a kind of an idea of global inequality. So we might refer to the first as domestic or within state inequalities, the second as international inequality or inequalities between states, and then think about the interaction of those together as a problem of global inequality. So, as I say, apologies if this is all really very familiar, and I'm not going to go into it in loads of detail anyway, but just to clarify kind of some terms about how we might measure some of those inequalities. Here we have this is a very typical way of measuring domestic inequalities within states, a Lorenz curve, and basically all that does is plot on a chart the distribution of income or wealth. You can do it for wealth too, for all sections of society, as in deciles, quintiles. You can break down the distribution of society in which way you want, and the curve there demonstrates how far. So the straight line demonstrates a society where each section of the population has an equal share of income or wealth, or whatever it is that we're thinking about the distribution of. And then the two curves show populations with differing forms of inequality deviating from that perfect straight line of inequality. And the basic story that those two curves show is that the second one is a much more unequal society. So the greater the deviation from that straight line, the greater the amount of inequality. So in curve 2 there, we've got at the top end here, I think you can see my cursor on the screen. At the top end, we have 10% of the population sharing about 70% of overall social income. So that's a very unequal society. There are ways of boiling that down. So obviously a Lorenz curve is very good as a graph for an individual society. And if I guess you could draw 2 or 3 lines on there to represent different countries in order to compare them. But if you were going to try and do that over time and between many countries, that's a very clumsy, awkward way of measuring. So when we do that, we try and make summary measures. And one very common way is a Gini coefficient, which is basically just the ratio of the areas on that chart on the Lorenz curve to produce a single number, so a coefficient between 0 and 1, where 0 would be perfect equality, everything is shared as on that straight line, and 1 would be perfect inequality, so you would have a flat line right to the bottom and then a very steep curve for the top. So for the top 1 person, that would be 1 person owns everything and everybody else has nothing. There are other ways of doing that, although the Gini coefficient tends to be the one that's used in international comparisons just because it is a single number, but there are other ways of doing that. Such as working out top income shares for the top 10%, 1%, etc. Or a different way of thinking about it is the other end of the spectrum is thinking about relative poverty measures. So, for instance, in the UK, we have a relative poverty measure of proportion of the population that are below 60% of the median income. And there are other measures of international inequality, like those used in the Sustainable Development Goals, for example, which tend to be much more they tend to be more absolute measures. So, the proportion of, I can't even remember what the SDG measure is now, but it's something like $2.50 a day or something like that as an income. And then ratio measures. In national comparisons, we can take the Gini coefficient as our international comparison, but other ways of doing that, particularly thinking about not necessarily comparing domestic inequalities, but comparing overall inequalities between states, we tend to take alternative measures like gross domestic product, so overall output or overall national income divided by the number of people in the population, so a per capita income. And again, there's all sorts of measurement problems associated with that, but that's one common way of measuring the distribution of international wealth between the different political units in the system. Development studies obviously had a kind of a way of thinking about those as a development problem. Traditionally, a kind of a curve a little bit like this that we see, what we call the Kuznets curve. And here the idea is that as per capita income increases, the nature of the domestic inequality problem changes. So the Kuznets curve really is a way of bringing into dialogue those two ideas between domestic inequality and inequality between nation states. And the Kuznets idea was that as per capita income grew, so as states became as converged towards a high income equilibrium, if you like, then, or towards a high income standard. So as more states became, basically the assumption was as more states became like the global West and North, inequality would go through, domestic inequalities would go through a series of transitions. So as income grew, you would get initially an increase in inequality, which is the kind of line going through A to B there, or the curve going through A to B. Then it would reach some kind of turning point through the industrialization process, and particularly as that process gave way to a service sector economy, that turning point would be reached, and domestic inequality would start to fall towards D. And that really is the idea that industrial economy, and then particularly a service sector economy, develops a larger and larger middle class that swallows up larger and larger sections of the of a underclass or a dispossessed poor, that they move into the middle class, and elites also decline in importance as the middle class also swallows those up. Basic consequence of the Kuznets curve, of course, is that you, in terms of a policy problem for development, is not to worry too much about inequalities, but to promote the growth in national income, and ultimately that will trickle down and distribute through society and reduce the problem associated with inequality. Of course, all those measures both omit and intersect with other important dimensions of inequality. So feminist political economy, feminist development studies, feminist sociology has often pointed out that anything that we've measured there excludes a large proportion of what happens in society. So various estimates, and of course this differs for different countries because it depends how work is organized on a gendered basis. But even in Europe today, where there's quite high levels of female labor market participation, the idea is that there's an awful lot of work that's absolutely essential for the economy. I can't go to work unless I've eaten, I've cleaned my house, I've washed my clothes, I've got a roof over my head for shelter so I can sleep properly. Unless all those things happen, I can't go to work and sell my labor power in the formal economy. And that means that 30 to 40%, and actually sometimes much higher than that, of the value of work in society is not captured by measures of national income, which only account for paid work in the formal economy, and various measures over time. I mean, there are the ILO produces all sorts of measures that shows it voluntary work done in the community, caring and domestic labour done at home, self-provisioning in subsistence agriculture and so on, is actually a huge part of the economy that is not captured in those measures of national income, or the distribution of national income as in Gini measures. A further point made obviously by feminist scholarship across all those areas of study and disciplines is that not just is that work not counted, but that tends to be done in the vast majority of cases by women. And if you look at time use studies across all countries, in fact, that have time use data available to them, it's very clear that the vast majority of that work is done by women, that literally isn't counted in our international comparisons of between country inequality or within country inequality, thinking about Gini index. Furthermore, obviously, both the inequalities that are not counted and the inequalities that are counted overlap to a substantial degree, particularly at an international scale, but also domestically, with racial, ethnic, and other cultural inequalities. So that's very clear. If we look at the history of colonialism in the international system, that there is an overlap between race, ethnicity, and other cultural markers and national inequalities of wealth. So if you look back right to Du Bois or Frantz Fanon, for example, they were talking about a colour line in the international system that reflected or substantially overlapped with our definitions of global north, global south, and so on in development studies, but also domestic inequalities between ethnic and racial groups, some of which are driven by a history of colonialism, particularly, for example, in my own country, where migration to the UK is substantially shaped by pre-existing colonial patterns, but is not reducible to that. So there are, huge disparities of income and wealth, but also some of those other forms of inequality. So a major theme in domestic politics in the UK, for example, at the minute, is how people of different ethnicities. You can see my slides, right? I'm just checking that you are seeing my slides. Yeah. Okay. I had that sudden fear that I was sharing the wrong screen, and all you could see was me looking at you. Okay. So a major issue in UK politics at the minute is that there is a substantial inequality between different racial and ethnic groups in their experience of the criminal justice system, for example. The police take action against certain racial groups much more than they do against others. Not only the police, once you're arrested, the courts are much more punitive for the same type of offence against some racial groups than they are others. And then the experience inside prisons and so on is also unequal. So that there's multiple forms of those inequalities that are not just economic, although my kind of background is economic. And Kimberly Crenshaw, very famously, and I doubt anybody's not come across Kimberly Crenshaw now, talks about that as an intersectional problem, by which she means a prism for seeing the way in which various forms of inequality often operate together. So, thinking about gender inequality alone is not sufficient to capture things. You need to think about the intersection of gender and class, and gender and race, and gender and sexuality, and other forms of disabilities, the one that's often left out of West European scholarship. So what do I want to get over here? So I want to get over the idea that inequality is a complex and contested issue. It's not straightforward to measure, although we do have some very common measures. Some of those I've introduced to you, but they're complex, contested. They often omit what are perhaps some of the most important aspects of inequality, particularly the ways in which inequalities intersect. It's very unusual to see quantitative measures in particular of complex intersections of inequality. But I want to leave you with the basic point about, in thinking about inequality as an international problem, is thinking about it, one, within states, and two, between them, notwithstanding some of those complexities that I've just mentioned. Okay, so there's been a great deal of scholarship over the last 10 years looking at global inequality as the kind of interaction between domestic and international inequality. And again, one of those people that you can't fail to have come across in thinking about this is Thomas Piketty, French economist and author of very large books that, despite their length and complexity, finds for some reason find their way into the public imagination such that they are kind of airport bestsellers and the like. And the good thing about Piketty, despite the volume of his work, is that he produces and seems committed to sharing his data on a public basis. So if you use that website at the top right hand corner of the screen, you'll be able to, and by the way, I'll send you these slides, Shinta, so you can share them afterwards if that's of use to anybody, but you can get that data for yourself. I think probably the graph on the screen is certainly as a starting point, the kind of major Piketty contribution. So his basic point here is, for those countries where we have good data and we can measure it over a long period of time, there is a pattern emerging, and that pattern is that within country inequality, so domestic inequalities, which is what's shown in that graph, were very high until some point in the early to middle of the 20th century, with the trigger point being two major systemic conflicts, and then fell, partly as a political reaction to those conflicts. And at some point in that period, post Second World War, there were a set of normative decisions taken about how to reorganize those societies where we have this data. So it tends to be North America and Western Europe, although there are some other countries with good long-term data too. And as a result of those normative decisions, so how society ought to be reorganized, inequalities have risen. And his point is they are rising to such an extent that in the United States, at least, they are somewhere near where the picture was in the early part of the 20th century, when the robber barons, Rockefellers and Carnegies and so on commanded the industrial structure of the United States. If we take a little broader look here, and I managed to get Indonesia on the in the data there. If we look at a rather kind of broader pattern, we again see a similar picture. So the first horizontal, the first vertical line, sorry, is one which we can discount to some extent because the data is not so great. And we see certainly two areas of kind of commonality with Piketty's data. We see a kind of period of what we might call the social democratic period, where inequalities generally were falling, and they were falling in industrialized social democratic states with welfare systems, but they were also falling for newly independent former colonies as they started to industrialize and started a process of catch-up. And in a sense, what that first kind of, this first block of time here suggests is that Kuznets curve that it started out with had some validity to it, and was and industrial catch-up and growth in national income was driving a process of convergence of and reductions in inequality. And what this kind of period here does is just reinforce the Piketty problem, if you like, is why is inequality rising to such a great extent? And his answer is financialization in large part. But why is it also doing so on such an international basis? So it's not just Europe and North America where that's happening. We see that happening in other places. So you see that as Russia, the kind of post-Soviet transition in Russia. You also see that in a more varied form in Indonesia, which is our little red bubbles here. And you see that in China as China develops a kind of more advanced capitalist economy. Our second way of thinking about inequalities then was between states. So here we simply have per capita output, so GDP per head, and we see a process of an alternative set of data that doesn't sort of mirror the Piketty data. It shows a process of catch-up. So it shows a process of reduction in international between state inequalities over time, particularly after 2000 and the kind of setting of the Millennium Development Goals and so on. We see a process of rapid reductions in inequalities between some countries. So in reductions in international inequality between some countries, not all. So a large part of the reduction in poverty in the post-2000 period and a reduction in international inequalities is actually driven by China and Russia and some parts of East Asia, including, as the slide shows, Indonesia. We can bring those two sets of data into conversation with one another, however. And this is the kind of famous elephant graph from Branko Milanovic. And what this simply shows is how those two stories come together to affect different groups in the global population. So over that period where domestic inequalities have increased in many countries and inequalities between countries have reduced, that has shaped the experience of 4 or 5 different groups. One is the very poorest in society who've been locked out of growth. And these are your absolute poor, the people that the Sustainable Development Goal captures, usually in agriculture, maybe in very low quality industrial work in this kind of sweatshop labor kind of condition. Then the rise in incomes, the kind of winners from this, or the partial winners from this process, rising incomes in emerging market economies. So the kind of lower middle class in China and East Asia in particular. Relative losers in this process is the middle class in developed countries, and then the real winners is the top 10% are actually really the top 1%, the people in the first class lounges in airports. Usually, if you wanted to stick a label on them somewhere, you would find them there. They're the booming global elite, usually benefiting in some way, either from institutions, state institutions or international organizations, or mainly finance. So that's where their gains are coming from. So the narrative really there is we have a historical process of moving from a kind of 19th century system dominated by colonialism with very high levels of both international and domestic inequality, with particular forms of gender inequality that transition as a result of industrialization, very clear racial inequalities in the most extreme examples shaped by the invention of racial categories in the first place to justify slavery. An interwar crisis that brings that is at least partly driven by those inequalities and leads to a collapse of the system, the creation of a new international regime in which development studies features as a very significant part, and a concern to limit the nature of inequalities within some countries, but leaving significant inequalities to be dealt with by development studies as an area of study internationally, or social policy as an area of study in some other states. Very similar concerns, but expressed differently with different literatures and so on. And then a neoliberal period in which those domestic inequalities have risen, but international inequalities have reduced. So what does that all mean as a kind of a development studies issue? Well, if Kuznets was correct, as I've already said, you worried less about inequality and more about income overall, and growth would take care of inequality over a course of time. In old debates on development, as I think you've kind of focused on them in what you've been looking at, you saw debates, right? You saw modernization theory, which was a kind of a driven by an assumption that Kuznets, or not driven by, but included an assumption that the Kuznets curve was correct, versus a kind of dependency answer to why wasn't there more development in newly independent countries. And there the issue was, well, this is a function of the international system. So it's a function of inequalities between states and things like unequal terms of trade, unequal access to finance, unequal access to technology. And that prevented growth, but also prevented reductions in inequalities. So the issue there to deal with was to deal with those inequalities or those international inequalities, and that would then deal with domestic inequalities. So in a sense, both modernization and dependency theory, although they had rival explanations for the development problem, had a very similar take on the relationship between domestic and international inequalities. Or very similar take on the Kuznets curve. That this was an appropriate way of thinking about it. Now, of course, since that time, we've had a variety of, and I don't want to treat these as exactly the same, because there are very distinct differences between Sen's work on the Human Development Index, for example, and post-Washington consensus ideas of pro-poor growth and poverty reduction. But to some extent, they treat inequality as a similar problem. So to some extent, that's about participation, and that Sen's insight that democratization and inclusion of a wide range of social groups would help them to signal that there is a problem, and therefore overcome some of the major problems of inequality, like famines and so on. But also aligning with that idea is one that's increasingly held within international organizations, the idea that inequality is actually bad for growth. It's not just that growth will reduce inequality, but inequality itself is a barrier to growth. Because, for example, if you have a very unequal society, the poor cannot see a way of getting up to here, so they do not invest in skills. And that's one of the major insights from international organizations over recent years, which is why they have a preference for very targeted social protection, because they think that very targeted social protection will allow a floor under which inequality can't go at the bottom, and therefore the poor are able to still make good decisions about education and health and so on, and compete for a position in the hierarchy. Okay, so I've got some. I'm aware of time, so sorry, Shinta, but I will hang around to answer your questions. Don't worry. But I'll wrap up by explaining what I think is the major inequality, is a major international problem driven by inequality now. So as we've seen, as Milanovic, as Piketty, as others show, domestic inequality now is high by post-war standards, particularly in Western Europe and North America. That intersects to some extent with greater gender equality, but that's not the same in all places. That's very clearly path dependent. If you had a very clear male breadwinner model underpinned by a strong redistributory welfare system, that meant that there was a very big difference between male and female participation in the formal economy, and therefore greater gender equality. So as more women joined the formal economy, that pushed household incomes apart because of two high earner couples, or two high earner adults in a household and two low earner or no earner households in adults in a household. That would drive the income distribution apart. That's clearly very different in places where you never had that welfare structure in the first instance. And there's there's quite a lot of debate over that in feminist political economy, for example, about assumptions that assume that there was a strong welfare system to begin with. There is no real, there's no disappearance of the problem of either gender or racial inequality in the international system. And there are reductions in international inequalities between states, but as we've said, other international inequalities remain. The reductions in international inequality are very largely driven by China and India. And then a small number of other states. But if you exclude those from the analysis, then international, reductions in international inequality start to reduce. And then there are two problems that particularly worry me. So one is the emergence of a kind of a new politics of inequality associated with not necessarily increasing inequality, but increasing popular realization of inequalities, and that driving popular discontent. And so very big political challenges in the international system, like Trump, like the breakup of the European Union, or at least the exit of the UK, which may signal others to leave that bloc, which is driven in very large part by popular realization of inequality and the discontent that drives. At the same time as a substantial theme in geopolitics, which is, reaffirmation of the desire of some states to close international inequality gaps, particularly thinking about China and Russia, and therefore becoming dissatisfied with the nature of the international system that reproduces those international inequalities, and therefore questioning whether that international system is really for them, and trying to disrupt that international system. Now, that's to some extent realized, I think, by major development organizations. It's certainly realized by the World Bank. It's realized by the International Monetary Fund. It's certainly realized by the International Labour Organization, by the United Nations. And they all have slightly different normative concepts to try and get to grips with this. So, the idea of inclusive growth, or decent work, or sustainable development, or I had another one in my mind, but these rival normative ideas for how development ought to be organized are all to some extent shaped by a concern that inequality is now a problem that it wasn't in the past, when you could assume that the Kuznets curve would drive a reduction, or the assumptions around the Kuznets curve would drive a reduction in inequalities as per capita income grew. And this drove a lot of the kind of high profile public pronouncements of organizations like the OECD or the IMF around, or World Bank for that matter, around inequalities, drove a lot of kind of interest in those organizations, because they were previously associated with a kind of neoliberal or structural adjustment model, Washington consensus model, particularly in East Asia following the kind of financial crisis of the 1990s, right? They were associated with policies that increase inequality, so a lack of concern with inequality. And so their contemporary, very recent concern with this as a policy issue is to some extent confusing. Yet, if you ask them, they're very clear about why they see this as a problem. They see it as a problem because they think in some countries it drives political destabilization, and in other countries it is a barrier to growth for the reasons I said previously. Very poor people in conditions where there are large differences between them and the rest do not invest in health, do not or cannot invest in health or skills, and therefore they can't get out of that problem. And that is a barrier to further growth, which is I won't tell you about this now, but some of the papers that I've written make that argument in summary form, and they're on my kind of post lecture reading if you're motivated to do any of that. Several people, try and deal with analysis of what this means for the future of development. So the future of capitalist economies and those countries transitioning to capitalism still. So Milanovic thinks that that's could lead to the collapse of a generalized liberal capitalism in favor of a political capitalism. So the former he associates with the United States, and the latter with China. Another person I suggest you read is Paul Kamak. He argues much the same, really. So he says that if we take all this these kind of patterns that I've been describing together, the future of global capitalism doesn't look like a transition to liberal capitalism, which was really the assumption in the old paradigm of development that you, as you call it, but will and actually as also the new paradigm of development that you've been looking at, but will in fact look much more like Vietnam, or much more like Laos, or actually much more like Indonesia. So maybe there will be a transition to a more unequal form of capitalism, which is quite unstable, according to Kamak. And that again is a kind of a concern that Piketty is mobilized by. He's very clear that his normative preference is is to defend liberal democracy and the international order, and to produce policy suggestions like a global wealth tax that he thinks might lead us back towards that as the direction of change. And I want to just highlight this international tension that I've already mentioned as a threat to a liberal international order in multiple ways. So it's a threat to international order when it produces politicians like Donald Trump, in the sense that they're very internationally aggressive and assertive. The idea of making America great again was at the expense of others, notably China, but also other countries. But it's also the case that drives the behavior of states who are destabilizing or purposefully destabilizing that order, like Russia, China, or North Korea, but also and that might not be a bad thing. I'm not making a normative judgment on that. I'm just saying that's those states are motivated in part by a desire to reduce international inequalities in their own favor, but it also is a barrier to dealing with significant global problems like climate change, when alliance of less economically developed states say, why should they pay the cost for adjustment to climate change when other countries, notably the United States and Europe, have benefited for so long from resource depletion and the production of greenhouse gases and all the rest of it. And there are a variety of authors who now expect, particularly John Mearsheimer, but even those that used to be against Mearsheimer are now more worried about the prospects for global conflict arising from that process. I want to say one last thing, and I know I'm over my time, so I really apologize, but I think a further development of this problem is where to go with it. So if North European and North American elites are worried that domestic inequalities threaten political instability, and elites in China and Russia and others seek a narrowing of international inequalities, how do we go about dealing with those two problems? And my concern is that on one hand, you could deal with those problems perhaps by narrowing international inequalities at the expense, or as the Milanovic graph shows, at the further expense of the relatively of those with relatively high living standards in Europe and North America, and that some moral argument around that, but at the same time, that's likely to drive further political destabilization and the rise of other politicians like Trump and the kind of nationalist politicians that have found favor, for instance, this week in Italy. At the same time, we could deal with that problem perhaps by simply, and this is the international organization, this is the IMF development answer to this problem, well, you deal with it by increasing the consumption of poorer sections of population in East Asia, in Africa and Latin America. But the problem with that is, yes, there's no moral argument against that, of course, but the consequence of that could be, runaway environmental degradation, resource depletion, and climate change. So our big question is how to reconcile those issues. And, you know, to me, that means that inequality is the major question of international studies, but it's also a development studies problem. It's an international relations problem. It's an environmental science problem. It's a social policy problem. So we need transdisciplinary research to be able to deal with this as an issue. And we need it at multiple scales, global scale, national scale, local scale, household scale, and without doing that, you don't see the totality of the problem, and you certainly exclude issues like gender inequality from the analysis. And you also need to think about that as kind of variegators. So these patterns are not exact, even though there are common patterns. The Piketty-Milanovic research shows there are common patterns. They're not the same in all places, in all societies. So detailed empirical research is needed in particular contexts to unpick the detail of the broader patterns that I've identified. So I'm going to stop there. I do have some suggested reading, some of which is mine, that kind of illustrates the argument I was trying to make. But I would obviously suggest you read some of those kind of Piketty-Milanovic work. So I'm very happy to take questions. I've got I've got time to take as many questions as you've got right now, or comments, or shared agendas for where you might go with future research and so on. I can't hear you, Shinta. I think you might be on mute.
Oh yeah, sorry. Okay, that was a very interesting lecture, Alex. Broader and deeper our understanding of inequality, not only just about individual or personal issue, but it also has relation to global issue, and then maybe political instability. Yeah, that was very interesting lecture. Okay, the next step, I will give opportunity for the audience. Please. Will you answer the question one by one, or will to the first three and then to answer? It's okay. Okay, one by one. It's okay. Okay, please. The first question, please.
Okay. Mr. Nunn, Ms. Sinta. Maybe I have one question about inequality. In 2023, the world is predicted to experience a recession, as we read on social media news. What do you think about this issue, and what about inequality in a recession in the future? Will developed countries continues to lead the world, or maybe are there developing countries that will benefit from that experience recession? I think it's for me, Mr. Al.
Okay, thank you, Mas Ganjar. Please, Alex.
Do you want me to answer that now? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I mean, the thing about recessions is they're complicated in their measurement effects. So what you sometimes get in initial economic downturns is an initial impact on financial values, so asset values and so on, which look like they impact the wealthiest groups the most. So global financial crisis 2008, for example, the initial kind of analysis of that was that those holding very large financial assets obviously lost a lot initially, while some other groups, social groups, were protected by, say, social protection policies or unemployment benefit and so on, from the very worst effects at the initial point. But what's very clear is since that point in time, the very rich are very good at using those financial assets and offloading losses and so on, and regaining their previous wealth quite quickly. So the impact of what we're seeing at the moment, particularly high prices, an economic crisis where prices rise usually benefit those that control that benefit from price rises, right? So they tend to be those that have existing wealth and assets, and they're very bad for the very poor. So I anticipate, obviously, the kind of recession that we're starting to enter now, or have entered in many countries, having a very deleterious effect on inequality. Although, given what I said previously, the variegated nature of that will mean that that will be quite different in different countries. But as Shinta mentioned to me the other day, I've been reading in the news about the nature of the UK, and it's true. More than a third of children now in the UK live in poverty, and in every town, in every part of the UK, there are food banks. And this is what, I don't know where we stand now in per capita income. It's something like the 6th or 7th largest economy in the world. A large section of the population now are dependent on charity to eat, which is, a remarkable turnaround from when I grew up. I'd never heard of a food bank until I was, in my 30s. And so, the current recession comes on the back of very high rates of poverty and pre-existing inequalities. And I think one of the issues there is what will be the political reaction to that when people who voted for things like Brexit, or people who voted previously in the United States for Trump, or people who voted this week in Italy for the right-wing parties there that have a nationalist agenda, that they cloaked in a rhetoric of delivering benefits for the very poor. What happens to those social groups when they realize they are not benefiting? And that, I think, is a very dangerous political condition to be in. Your other question, so I would anticipate inequalities to rise, but also that the political tensions around that may also rise, and that will be different in different countries. But it has significant possibilities of spillover effects and so on. The issue about developing versus kind of leading states, if you like. It seems to me again that the world is in a very difficult and dangerous position. In terms of the United States, all the kind of long-term indicators of relative power are in decline, except for military spending, and that creates a hugely dangerous international system, particularly when, as I mentioned before, some states are set for perfectly justifiable reasons on closing international gaps between them and the leading state. So I think we can look forward to a period where we may experience further turmoil, and we're getting used to it, aren't we, in terms of climate disasters, increased migration, pandemics, and also geopolitical conflict. So I think we probably look forward to a period of large-scale instability in the international system, in which inequality is both a cause and a consequence of those instabilities.
Okay, thank you very much for your answer. Okay, Mas Ganjar, cukup? Enough, Mas Ganjar?
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, the next question, please, for students, maybe. Oh, Mas Gemilang, please. Mas Bayu.
Okay, thank you. I have several questions, but 1 second. Okay. You said about cause and consequences. Inequality as cause and consequences before, and political tension between states. But what I want to know is that how cultural and norms gonna gonna develop in inequality, because in my understanding, I'm a Japanese, but I see some a double standards from literally everyone. Like the I read about the welfare constitution draft about the male maternal leave, if I remember correctly. It's about 40 days of paid leave for male who his wife is uh, on maternal leave. Sorry, but in lower class, we males that usually take paid leave for uh, maternal purposes is punished socially. Like you'll get shunned by female workers that know that you took paid leave for that. That's probably the most uh, interesting things, because in upper levels of Indonesia, the inequality, the gender equality, or so I say, is become a very prominent problems. But in the lower classes, like uh, agricultural aspect, for example, I think Indonesia is gaining. No, is declining. The agricultural aspect of Indonesia is declining because there are no new generation of like farmers and like uh, market vendors and the likes. Uh, like in my area, I have a little project of mine. I uh, I question some newer generation people, like 20 below, that almost zero, like one or two people that want to be a farmer. And in my area itself, farmers are upwards 40 years old and up. So I think the Japanese sayings of old, like dapur sumur kasur, that relegates females to the domestic, not the domestic, family problems, and not like professional stuff, is like on your graph about the income, post-war income, is very relatable. But there are a few drawbacks on what I see on the reality. Like some females now not only doesn't want to become like low class worker, but also uh, doesn't really push their agenda, like feminist overall feminist gender equality agenda is uh, I, I can say it's broad, but in my local area, it's the low class stuff, like agriculture and the likes, is not pushed hard like that. So I wanna know what your opinion about the cultural and norms, because it most likely it will clash, especially with the global culture you mentioned earlier in your presentation. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much for your question. That's really, really useful and really helpful. And I think there are lots of international patterns, and again, they take on different details in different countries, obviously. But one of the changes driven by highly unequal economic change, whether that be industrialization, so away from agriculture towards industry, or whether that be deindustrialization, conversely, away from industry towards service sector employment, is that it leaves behind skills shortages. So often those sectors don't fully decline or disappear because they still have some use, but nobody wants to do them because they don't earn as much, or they're seen as culturally backward, and that obviously or not backward, less valuable. That obviously creates an economic problem. So you talked very eloquently about a problem of agricultural labor in Indonesia. We have exactly the same problem around agricultural labor in the UK, and that was previously filled by migrant workers from Europe, and because of Brexit they don't any longer exist, and they all went back to Poland or Romania or other parts of Europe. And so we've got a huge problem with nobody able to pick fruit, for example, or at harvest time. A huge problem with lack of construction workers, again driven by the same problem. Everybody wants to be bankers and work in insurance or something. So we have exactly the same problems, and of course they're overlaid by some gender problem issues. So for a while, I think this is dying down a little bit now, but for a while men didn't want, young men, and particularly young less skilled men and white British boys didn't want to work in what they perceived to be feminized or women's work in the service sector. So they didn't want to work in hospitality, catering, care work, those kinds of industries, which have all been on the growth industries. They wanted to do what their dads or their granddads did in factories or coal mines or these kinds of things. So we had a huge problem with that was connected to exactly what you say, which was the link between culture and the economy, and that produced this large underclass of white working class boys that we describe as not being in employment, education, or training. And that's been quite a similar problem across North America and Europe. So very similar problems to what you're talking about, but their details are different in different places. In terms of global cultures, though, I think so it's a slightly different issue, but in terms of global cultures, one of the consequences of change in leadership in the international system is that organizations like the IMF or like the World Bank, I think it's clear to see, particularly in East Asia, right, that they have declining legitimacy over time, particularly because of the Asian financial crisis and its kind of the ongoing effects of restructuring for that, but also because of geopolitical power shift. And so normative ideas about what appropriate development policy might be and how to pursue that may not any longer come from those institutions in the future. And you already see rival claims for normative goals around development. And in particular from Chinese foreign policy around different forms of development associated with infrastructure projects and so on, that don't have the same cultural baggage, if you like, that say pro development or the IMF's version of, or the World Bank's version of lending in terms of gender inclusion. China's not so bothered about that in terms of in terms of what it asks states to do in participating in its funded infrastructure projects. So you're likely to see not just those local level cultural contestations that you spoke about in terms of changing economic patterns, but very big global shifts in the cultural expectations that come with normative approaches to development, or rival normative approaches to development.
Okay, thank you very much, Alex. So,
Question, hopefully.
no, not yet, not yet. Okay. Thank you very much for your answer, for Mas Gilang, Mas Bayu. Okay, the next question, the third, please. Tiara, please.
Good morning. Good morning. Good evening, Mr. Good evening, Mr. Alex. My name is Tiara. I want to ask you a question that there are still many political leaders who push inequality. There are still many political leaders who push inequality agenda or policy that endorse inequality in society, such as Donald Trump, and in Indonesia, especially, the government still focus more on Java than in other regions. So what is the solution, and what is your opinion about this phenomenon? Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, wow.
Tiara.
I'm not sure. That's a great question. Thank you very much, and good evening to you. However, I'm not sure I have an answer to that. If I did, I might be Secretary General of the United Nations. But as you know, I mean, as you say, I mean, I share the idea that these are problems, but whether I've got a solution to that, I'm not sure I do. I'm sorry to disappoint you. However, more people being aware of the nature of the problem. So to me, the thing I can do about that is education. It's producing research in ways that can be accessed by different groups. So when it's students, it's lectures. When it's other academics, it's peer-reviewed papers. It's also newspaper articles. It's also blogs. It's also social media posts, so that you're reaching a wider audience with your research and hopefully changing the way that people think about these issues. And that's about all I can do about it. But you need to think through for yourselves, especially you young people on the cusp of a professional career, about how you will confront those types of inequalities in your own working practice. And that might be being development practitioners, it might be being teachers, it might be being activists of one form or another, that challenge those inequalities, even in very small ways. So I don't have a big picture answer to your question, I'm sorry. But I think it's, we all have to do our little bit to try and challenge those inequalities where we can.
Okay. Thank you for the answer, Mbak Tiara. Enough? Alex, may I ask you questions?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll try. Okay, accelerating equality is one of the objectives of development, isn't it? Yeah. But
Say that
however,
again.
Okay.
Say that again. Sorry, I missed the first bit.
Okay, accelerating equality is one of the development objectives, isn't it? Yeah, but however, whether that initiative is successful or unsuccessful, equality could be produced. Is that right? And equality could be produced. Can then we draw that inequality still exists or cannot be eliminated regardless the development result or development outcome, like poverty maybe?
Yeah. So I'm not sure that dealing with inequality is always a development goal. And the reason I say that is, so I've talked a lot about, the United States or China or the UK or whatever. But for example, I've just been working in various Latin American countries where, I was dealing with very detailed aspects of institutional design, particularly around labour market, so how employment services, how vacancy, job vacancies are promoted to job seekers and workers. So very detailed aspects of policy design. And it's clear that in many places, governments are relatively unconcerned about inequality. And what they're more concerned about is still that Kuznets curve. They still think that driving greater growth will deal with the inequality problem, or then just not bothered, one of the two. And so they don't do things that are very obvious, like, in many Latin American countries, 70% of the population is in the informal sector. And yet they don't change the regulations of the formal sector in such a way as might incorporate that informal sector and enable the workers doing that work to get a better standard of living and reduce inequalities. They think that doing things that will just facilitate more investment will generate the growth and then reduce the inequality. And in that sense, I think their development model is wrong. So they have a model of development, but it is not more motivated by a reduction of inequality. And a little bit like in my answer to Tiara's question, when I'm doing that work with those governments, my challenge is to try and use evidence to show that they will be better off being more motivated by a concern with inequality than they are with a concern with purely economic growth. So I think, how you understand it, development, and how you shape both the objectives, but also very detailed aspects of practice, has a real impact on inequality. And I don't think you can assume that inequality is always a motivation for development activity. I don't know if does that answer your question at all, or?
Yes, that's good.
Even when rhetorically it might be, so, even rhetorically, sometimes people explain their objectives in terms that make them sound like they're about reducing inequality, even if they're not. And again, that's our job, right? As students, as professionals, is to really unpick who it is that will benefit from the policies or the interventions or the new institutions that we're looking at.
Okay. That's why in the local scale, you mentioned that greater equality in one state was related to greater inequality in others in your PPT. Is that right?
Yeah. Yes.
I like that statement.
So I
like
can.
I like it.
We can very clearly show, for example, that inequality in income has a massive impact on inequality in life expectancy. It also has a massive impact on inequality in resilience to disease. So the COVID pandemic really showed that very clearly. It was the poorer sections of society with less access to healthcare that suffered the most. We can show very clear link between gender inequality and inequalities in the experience of violence, for example. That there are good links between those two things. So often these things intersect or interact with each other, and they also definitely intersect. So the intersection of like Tiara's question in terms of spatial inequalities, being in particular places, intersects with race and ethnicity, and again that will intersect with gender. So often in those communities, the people that are most badly affected are the vulnerable minority women, as opposed to just vulnerable minorities. So they both interact and intersect. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much for your explanation. Okay. Okay, the next question, please. Is there any other question?
Maybe one question. Miss Sinta,
Is that okay, Alex?
Alex?
One question more? Is that okay?
Hello?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Sorry, one question, Alex. first, but I want to inform that now I am with the postgraduate student, and if you look my camera, okay, say hi to Alex, yeah.
Oh, wow.
Okay,
Hello,
that's
hello.
our student in the class of the Theory of Development Communication, Alex. That's our
Wow.
students.
Nice to meet you all. It's great to see you. Thank you for
Yeah.
coming today.
Okay.
Okay, so we are in on hybrid, in on hybrid Zoom, yeah. My question is, Alex, I am a football fan, yeah, but unfortunately not from England, yeah, but from Italy. In Leeds, I know the football club that Leeds
Yeah.
United, yeah, maybe, and Derby County, yeah,
United.
Derby County. As a football fan, I have a question about a sanction, yeah, against the Russian national football team in the World Cup because of the war against Ukraine and also their invasion. Well, Israel football team did not uh, what FIFA not sanction their team football team. How do you see about this about inequality in sport? Yeah, maybe, yeah, Alex. Thank you very much.
Do you
Well,
like football, Alex? Do you like football?
I do
Okay.
like football, and my team is
Yeah.
Liverpool.
Oh, the same with me. The same with me. The same with me. I like Iron Rush. Iron Rush.
Ah, right, Ian Rush. Yeah, well, I
You'll
grew up
never
in.
walk alone, Alex. You'll never walk alone.
So I know in Indonesia, Liverpool are popular, but so too are Manchester United, right?
Yeah.
And I dislike Manchester United. Yeah, I'm not a sports expert, although I like football. I'm not a sports expert, but it's a very unequal game. And of course, yeah, I'm sure you're right that there are all sorts of inconsistencies. I mean, you know, the United States, like many other countries, has a death penalty and locks up a large proportion of its young black population. Yet FIFA thinks doesn't take action against it for that, and has, you know, attacked many other countries and not been faced sanction by international sporting bodies. So yes, I think you're probably right. There are all sorts of inequalities, but I'm no expert on it. And I do know that, you know, my colleague Francesco Belcastro has been writing recently on Israel's attempts to legitimate itself by using sport as a kind of an international political lever to pull, if you like. And I don't, you know, it's not my area, so I don't know enough about it. I don't want to comment in ways that would upset anybody, because, you know, unless you're a Manchester United fan, in which case I'm perfectly happy to upset you.
It's understandable. Okay. Is there any other?
Thank you very much,
questions?
Alex. Thank you very much.
Is there any other questions for students? Any questions from students?
It's always absolutely fine if you have questions after. I'm sure there are, you know, many people wouldn't want to put their hand up and speak on a call like this, and in English as well. I mean, I've been very impressed by your ability to follow my accent.
Yes, of course. It's quite difficult to understand.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
It's okay. It's okay. It's okay. Okay.
But if you have questions that you want to send afterwards by email, I will do my best to answer them.
I will give you questions, many and many.
Great.
Okay. No question, students? Okay, Alex. There's no other question. Thank you very, very much for your time, for your everything. We always disturb you.
No, not at all. I've really enjoyed meeting you, and hopefully at some point in the future we might meet in person, and I will try and speak slowly and clearly.
Please come to Indonesia one day. to Purwokerto, to our campus.
That would
We'll
be
be very,
lovely.
very happy. Okay.
And it would be lovely to see you in Leeds.
Of course. Maybe you invited me.
Yeah, hopefully.
Hopefully, one day maybe. Okay, thank you very much, Alex, and everybody who participating in this lecture.
To you all, thank you very much for coming.
Take a picture.
Thank you, Alex.
Thank you, Alex. See you.
Thank
See you. Thank you
you.
very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi
Thank you,
wabarakatuh.
sir.
I close this lecture. Thank you for everybody. See you next.
Walk along.
Bye.